Every Wednesday morning, Gene pulls a folding chair into his garage, turns on a transistor radio, and spends 2 hours restoring old electronics he buys at estate sales. Soldering irons, capacitors in little plastic bins, a magnifying lamp clamped to a workbench he built himself in 2004. He's 67. Retired 3 years ago from a career as an electronics technician the guy companies called when equipment broke down on the production floor. Not an engineer, not management. The guy with the tool belt and the service van, his neighbors see him out there most mornings. Same routine, same khaki pants, same cup of coffee from the same mug. The house hasn't been painted in 6 years. The car in the driveway is a 2014 Accord with 152,000 miles on it. 2 doors down, a couple just took delivery of a Tesla Model Y. Across the street, the Hendersons are adding a second-story deck with a hot tub. The guy next door, younger, better title, bigger house, just refinanced to pull equity for a kitchen renovation. And when they glance at Gene's garage, some of them shake their heads. Nice guy, they say, but he clearly peaked a long time ago. Then one evening, Gene's daughter is at dinner with her husband. She mentions, almost in passing, that her parents just paid off their beach rental property in cash. The son-in-law stops chewing. Wait, your dad owns a rental property? 2, she says. And the portfolio. Mom said it crossed $1.3 million last quarter. The man with the tool belt. The mug. The 2014 Accord, $1.3 million, and a paid-off rental that throws off income every month. So the son-in-law asks the question everybody asks when they finally see behind the curtain. How? He never made more than $85,000 a year. How did he do that? Gene doesn't give him a speech. He picks up a book from the shelf, a paperback with a cracked spine and a dozen dog-eared pages, and sets it on the table. The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel. 5 lessons, Gene says. That's it. 5 lessons from this book that I actually followed while everybody else just agreed with them and moved on. Those 5 lessons are what this video is about. Not the theory, not the book review, the 5 decisions Gene made because of what he read and what each one cost him that no spreadsheet will ever show. Here's something most people won't admit. The Psychology of Money by Morgan Housel has sold over 5 million copies worldwide. It's been translated into more than 50 languages. If you've spent any time reading about personal finance in the last 5 years, you've either read it or you've heard someone talk about it like it changed their life. And maybe it did, for about a week. Because here's the pattern. Someone reads the book, they nod through every chapter, they highlight a few lines, they tell a friend you have to read this, and then nothing. Nothing changes. The same spending, the same habits, the same gap between what they know and what they actually do. This is the paradox that Morgan Housel himself talks about. The lessons in this book aren't complicated. A teenager could understand them. The problem was never knowledge. The problem is behavior. And behavior is the one thing you can't fix by reading. Unless you do what Gene did. Gene read the book at 52 years old. He was sitting in a waiting room, his wife was getting her annual checkup, and he grabbed it at the library the week before because someone at work mentioned it. He expected a finance book, charts, graphs, portfolio theory. What he got was something different. It felt like the author was describing my mistakes to my face, Gene says. Not yelling at me, just showing me, calmly. And the calm part made it worse because I couldn't argue with any of it. But Gene did something that 99% of readers don't do. He didn't just agree with the book, he treated it like a mirror. And he changed what he saw. Over the next 15 years, Gene turned 5 of those lessons into 5 concrete decisions. Not abstract principles, not things he sort of believed in. Actual changes to how he spent, saved, and thought about money. Changes that cost him friendships. Changes that made him look foolish. Changes that his own wife questioned more than once before she saw the results. And none of them were complicated. That's the part that will frustrate you. Because when you hear what Gene did, your first reaction won't be, I could never do that. It'll be, I could have done that years ago. That gap between I could have and I actually did is the only thing separating the people who read this book and nod from the people who read it and become free. Let's start with the lesson that hit Gene first, the one that made him feel like a fraud in his own driveway. Lesson 1, wealth is what you don't see. Gene remembers the exact moment this one landed. He was 48 years old, standing in the company parking lot after a shift, and a coworker named Phil pulled up in a brand new Cadillac Escalade, black chrome trim. The kind of car that makes everyone in a 50-foot radius stop and look. And they did. 3 guys from the floor walked over, someone whistled. Phil was beaming, leaning against the hood like he was posing for a magazine cover. Gene watched from his spot next to a 2006 Toyota Camry with a dent in the rear bumper. One of the guys looked over and laughed. "Gene, when are you going to treat yourself, man?" Gene smiled. Didn't say a word. That night, sitting at the kitchen table, he opened his investment account and looked at the number. Then he pulled out a calculator and did something he'd never done before. He calculated the difference between Phil's monthly car payment and his own cost of keeping the Camry oil changes, insurance, the occasional repair. The gap was $487 a month. $487 every month, going in 2 completely different directions. This is the first lesson Gene took from The Psychology of Money, and it might be the most misunderstood idea in all of personal finance. Wealth is what you don't see. When you see someone driving a $65,000 car, you know exactly one thing about them. They have $65,000 less than they did before. Or worse, they owe $65,000 plus interest. That car isn't evidence of wealth, it's evidence of spending. And spending is the opposite of wealth. The actual wealthy, the people who have built 7-figure net worths on 5-figure salaries, are invisible. You don't see their wealth because their wealth is in the things they didn't buy. The car they didn't upgrade, the kitchen they didn't renovate, the vacation they didn't finance. That money didn't disappear, it compounded. Here's a number that puts this in perspective. According to the Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances, the median net worth of American families between 55 and 64 is approximately $224,000. And a significant chunk of that is home equity, not liquid investable assets. The actual cash and investments sitting in accounts for the typical household approaching retirement, far less than most people assume. Gene understood something that most people spend their whole lives missing. Every dollar has 2 lives, the life where you spend it and it's gone, and the life where you invest it and it multiplies. The Camry wasn't a sacrifice. It was a decision about which life he wanted his dollars to have. And here's what happened to that $487 a month. Gene redirected it automatically every month into a low-cost index fund. He started at 48. By the time he retired at 64, that single decision, just the car decision, nothing else had grown to over $138,000 from a car he didn't buy. Phil? He traded the Escalade in after 4 years, still owed $11,000 on it, rolled the negative equity into a new lease, started the cycle over. By the time he retired 2 years after Gene, he'd spent over $110,000 on vehicles in 15 years and owned nothing. Gene never told Phil any of this. He never told anyone, because that's the other part of this lesson that Housel writes about and that Gene understood instinctively. Wealth is quiet. The moment you show it, you've converted it into something else. A car, a watch, a house that impresses people you don't know. And once it's converted, it stops compounding. It stops working for you. It starts working for your ego. Gene chose to let his money work in silence. And silence, it turns out, pays better than applause. Lesson 2, the man in the car paradox. This lesson came next, and it cut deeper than the first one. Gene tells it like this. A few months after the parking lot moment with Phil, Gene was at a neighborhood barbecue, the kind with plastic chairs and paper plates, and someone's Bluetooth speaker playing the same classic rock playlist. One of the neighbors, a guy named Craig, showed up wearing a new watch, a Tag Heuer, $3,500 on his wrist, and everyone noticed. "Oh, that's sharp. Where'd you get that? Man, that's a statement piece." Gene stood there with a can of soda watching the whole thing and noticed something nobody else did. Nobody asked Craig a single question about himself. Not about his job, not about his family, not about what he'd been working on. Every question was about the watch. Every compliment was aimed at the object, not the person wearing it. And Gene thought, these people aren't admiring Craig, they're admiring the watch. They're imagining themselves wearing it. Craig paid $3,500 to be a mannequin for something other people are mentally trying on. This is what Morgan Housel calls the man in the car paradox. You buy a nice car thinking people will admire you, but they don't. They admire the car and imagine themselves in it. You're invisible. The thing you bought to be seen made you disappear. Gene says this was the lesson that freed him from caring what the neighbors thought. Because once you really understand this, not intellectually, but in your gut, the whole engine of status spending breaks down. Think about it. Every purchase made to impress someone is based on an assumption. The assumption that people will see the thing and think more of you. But they don't. They see the thing and think more of themselves. Your money bought their fantasy, not their respect. Here's where this connects to real numbers. The Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Survey estimates that the average American household spends between $4,000 and $6,000 per year on purchases driven primarily by social comparison items bought, not because they're needed, but because they're seen. Cars nicer than necessary, clothes beyond function, renovations triggered by what the neighbors did. Gene started calling this the admiration tax, the money you pay for attention you never actually receive. And once he named it, he couldn't unsee it. Every purchase decision ran through a new filter. Am I buying this for me or for an audience that isn't even watching? The answer, more often than he expected, was the audience. The hardest part, Gene says, wasn't giving up the stuff. It was giving up the idea that anyone cared. You spend years believing people are paying attention, and then you realize they were never looking at you. They were looking at what you had. And once you stop having things to show, they stop looking entirely. That sounds like a loss. Gene says it was the most liberating thing that ever happened to him. Because when nobody's watching, you finally get to choose what actually matters to you. Lesson 3, getting wealthy versus staying wealthy. Gene learned lessons 1 and 2 from observation. He learned lesson 3 from fear. In 2008, the market collapsed. Gene's portfolio, which he'd been building quietly for 6 years at that point, dropped 34% in less than 5 months. He watched $180,000 become $119,000. On paper, $61,000 vanished. A coworker named Stanley, same age, similar portfolio, size, panicked. He called his broker on a Monday morning in October 2008 and liquidated everything. Sold his entire 401k at the bottom, locked in losses north of $140,000, money he would never get back because he pulled it out of the game permanently. Gene didn't sell. Not because he was brave, not because he had some superior insight into market cycles. I was terrified, Gene admits. I couldn't sleep for 2 weeks. My wife asked me 3 times if we should sell. I almost said yes. But he'd read something in Housel's book that stuck something that overrode the fear. Barely. Getting wealthy requires optimism, the belief that things will go up, that risk will be rewarded, that the future will be better than the present. But staying wealthy requires the opposite. It requires humility, fear even. It requires accepting that some of what you gained was luck and that the way you keep it is by refusing to do anything stupid during the moments when everyone around you is doing something stupid. Housel calls it the survival mindset. Gene calls it simpler than that. I just kept saying one sentence to myself over and over. Don't do something, just stand there. That's it. That's the whole strategy. And here's the data that proves why standing still was the right move. According to research by Dalbar, the average American equity investor earned an annualized return of roughly 3.6% over the past 30 years, while the S&P 500 returned approximately 10% over the same period. The difference is behavior. Selling during crashes, buying during euphoria, switching strategies with every headline. The market delivered 10%. Investors captured 3.6%. The gap is pure emotion. Gene stayed in. The market recovered. By 2012, his portfolio had not only recovered the $61,000, it had grown beyond what it was before the crash. The money he didn't sell went on to compound for another 12 years. Stanley? He put some money back into the market in 2013, 5 years after he sold. He missed the entire recovery. By the time he reinvested, the S&P had already more than doubled from its 2009 low. The money he locked in as a loss would have been worth over $350,000 if he'd done nothing. Nothing. That was the entire strategy. Gene describes his investment approach the same way every time someone asks. My strategy is so boring it would clear a room at a dinner party. Index funds. Automatic contributions. Don't look at it when the news is bad. Don't touch it when the news is good. I have done nothing interesting with my money in 15 years, and that's why I still have it. The difference between Gene and Stanley isn't intelligence. It isn't information. It's temperament. Gene survived, and survival in investing is the only strategy that compounds. Lesson 4, freedom, the highest dividend. If lessons 1 through 3 are about what Gene didn't do, didn't buy the car, didn't chase the status, didn't sell in the crash, lesson 4 is about why, the reason behind all of it. Gene describes the morning after he officially retired. No alarm, no route planned, no meeting to prepare for. He woke up, made coffee, and walked to his garage workshop. He sat down at his bench, picked up a half-finished radio restoration project he'd been working on for 3 weeks, and started soldering. At 10 in the morning, he looked up and realized something. Nobody in the world needed him to be anywhere, and he didn't need anything from anyone. No paycheck to protect, no boss to answer to, no schedule to follow, except the one he chose. That moment, Gene says, was worth more than any number on any statement. I'd been working toward it for 15 years, and I didn't even fully understand what it was until I felt it. This is the lesson Morgan Housel considers the most important in the entire book, and it's the one most people skip right over because it doesn't come with a formula or a percentage. The highest form of wealth is the ability to wake up every morning and say, I can do whatever I want today. Not a yacht, not a vacation home, not a portfolio number with enough zeros to impress a stranger. Freedom, control over your time. The ability to say no to things that drain you and yes to things that fill you without asking anyone's permission. And here's what makes this lesson painful for a lot of people. You can earn $250,000 a year and have zero freedom if your lifestyle requires every dollar of that income. If the mortgage, the cars, the private school, the club membership, the vacations all demand that the paycheck keeps coming, then you're not wealthy. You're employed. There's a difference. Gene earned $85,000 a year at his peak. His neighbors earned more. Some of them earned a lot more. But Gene has something almost none of them have: a Wednesday morning in a garage with a soldering iron and nowhere he has to be. One of Gene's former co-workers, a man who earned over $120,000 in his last years before retirement, went back to work at 66. Not because he wanted to, because his lifestyle wouldn't let him stop. The house, the cars, the monthly obligations that grew every time his salary did. He retired for 8 months, ran the numbers, and went back. He makes more money than I ever did, Gene says, and he has less freedom than I've had since the day I turned in my badge. That's not a money problem. That's a design problem. He designed a life that needs a paycheck. I designed one that doesn't. Research from the Employee Benefit Research Institute supports this. Only about 37% of Americans over 50 feel confident they'll have enough money for a comfortable retirement. Not because they didn't earn enough, because they built lives that consume everything they earn. The treadmill doesn't stop because the paycheck gets bigger. The treadmill speeds up. Gene stepped off. And stepping off, it turns out, was the whole point. Lesson 5, room for error. Gene saved the last lesson for the one that almost nobody follows, because it feels like waste. At 61, Gene needed surgery, a procedure not fully covered by insurance. Out-of-pocket cost $23,000. For most people approaching retirement, that kind of expense would mean selling investments at the wrong time, taking on debt, or delaying retirement by a year or more. Gene paid it from a separate account. An account he'd kept for over a decade, untouched, uninvested in anything aggressive, earning modest interest. A cash reserve equal to 18 months of his household expenses. His wife had questioned this account more than once over the years. That money's just sitting there, she'd say. It could be growing. Gene's answer was always the same. It's not sitting there. It's standing guard. This is what Morgan Housel calls room for error. And it might be the least glamorous, least exciting, most important concept in all of personal finance. Room for error means accepting that the future is unknowable and building a plan that doesn't require everything to go right. It means keeping money you could invest in a place where it earns almost nothing on purpose because the cost of not having it when you need it is catastrophic, and the cost of having it when you don't need it is just a slightly lower return. Most financial plans are built like a bridge, with no safety margin. They work perfectly as long as nothing unexpected happens. But something unexpected always happens. A medical bill, a job loss, a family emergency, a car that dies at the worst possible moment. And when the plan has no room for error, one surprise can unravel a decade of progress. Gene understood this intuitively. I didn't know I was going to need surgery. he says. I knew I was going to need something. I just didn't know what or when or how much. And that's exactly why the money was there. Here's the number that puts this in context. According to the Federal Reserve, nearly 40% of American adults, including many with above average incomes, could not cover a $400 emergency expense without borrowing. $400. Not $23,000. $400. These aren't reckless people. They're people who built lives without room for error, because room for error feels like waste. It feels like money doing nothing. And in a culture that celebrates optimization and maximum returns, doing nothing with money feels almost irresponsible. Gene sees it the other way. The money that saved me wasn't the money that grew the fastest. It was the money that was there when nothing else would have been. That's not waste. That's the plan working exactly how it was supposed to. Now let me be direct with you. If you're carrying heavy debt, the kind that keeps you up at 3 in the morning, these 5 lessons aren't your starting point. You've got a fire to put out before you can build anything. If you're facing a medical crisis or a financial emergency that's consuming every dollar, stability comes first. Always. And if you're 2 years from retirement with nothing saved, 5 lessons and a good book won't create a time machine. That's not how this works, and this channel doesn't pretend otherwise. But here's who this is for. If you're between 50 and 70, if you've earned a decent income for decades and you've got this nagging feeling, this quiet, persistent hunch that you should have more to show for it than you do, then Gene's story isn't ancient history. It's a blueprint. Not an overnight fix, but a real one. The lessons are free. The book costs less than a dinner for 2. The only real price is the comfort of staying the same. Here's what I want you to take from Gene's story. He doesn't have a yacht. He doesn't have a vacation home in the mountains. He doesn't post his portfolio online. Nobody on his street looks at him and thinks, that's the wealthy one. What Gene has is quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when your phone rings and you know it's not a bill collector. When the market drops 6% in a week and you don't flinch. When your neighbors are losing sleep over headlines and inflation and you're in the garage restoring a 1972 receiver, drinking coffee from the same mug you've had for 9 years. The Psychology of Money isn't a book about getting rich. It's a book about getting free. And the lesson most people ignore isn't any single chapter. It's the fact that agreeing with the book was never the point. Doing something about it was. Gene's son-in-law asked him that night what the book really taught him. Gene thought about it for a moment, then he said the thing that stuck. The book costs $16. The lessons are free. The real price is giving up who you pretend to be so you can finally keep what you actually earn. If this story hit close to home, drop a like. It helps more people find this. And here's what I want to know from you. Of those 5 lessons, which one did you need to hear the most? Drop it in the comments. If you're new here, subscribe. I put out videos like this every week. Take care of yourself. I'll see you in the next one.